Well, this case, Intel's site selection decision in Latin America, was based on my field research in Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Costa Rica. And of course, it helped a lot that Ted Telford, right, the key person mentioned in the case who was making the ultimate recommendation about where Intel should put this manufacturing plant, of course, Ted Telford was my former student. And so what I was able to do was speak to Ted and then eventually speak to the entire Intel site selection team and actually go down and visit each one of the countries and the locations and speak to the key government officials that Intel's team itself had visited, right? And so I got the government's perspective on all of this as well. So, ultimately, I think this this kind of gave me the broader perspective. A key thing to note is that Ted was a very smart guy, great guy, fantastic person, but he wasn't always necessarily the best student. So if you're reading the case and we're discussing this and you're saying, gee, why didn't he know this, or why didn't he make that? Why didn't he know that already? Even though he took Professor Nelson's class on Latin America. Well, keep in mind he didn't always come to class. So I it's not my fault, right? If something like that happens. So I think that's important to note. This case did also become, really sort of inspired me to get interested in how these site selection decisions are made and how companies do this. And so I eventually went out and did, a lot of research on other companies and their site selection processes. And that's, of course, my book on harnessing globalization, the promotion of non-traditional foreign direct investment in Latin America. And so chapter 1 of that book is Intel, and it sort of gives you the answers, if that's what you want to know, what Intel did and what happened later on, and brings us up to date. But I think what's important here, though, is for us is to think about this, and as we look at some of these discussion questions, why international? Why was Intel interested in putting this big investment outside of the United States? And why specifically in Latin America? I think it's important to remember, what kind of project we're talking about here, what Intel was going to be manufacturing in this plant. And so I think it's important to remember that distinction between an assembly and test plant, right, which is what this was, but it was going to still be a significant investment of over $300 to $500 million, employing thousands of mid-level technicians, as well as a couple of hundred engineers, at minimum. Even that is pretty sophisticated, right? But, of course, the fabrication plants that Intel does are even bigger projects, over $1 billion, and thousands of engineers and very sophisticated sorts of things. But even the assembly and test process for Intel, this kind of plant, there are lots of chemical processes and things. You do need people with some, at least mid-level technicians to evaluate the microprocessors. And of course, that's the product we're talking about. These are microprocessors, right? The brains inside the computer that were going to be manufactured in this plant. And that's a pretty sophisticated project. You need clean rooms, and you need these skilled technicians, as I mentioned. So what's interesting, I think, is to think about why would Intel want to do something like that outside of the United States, and why specifically in Latin America? So, clearly, you see in the case that one of the key factors was reducing costs. And especially because Intel had a lot of competition from AMD and others that maybe were not investing as much as Intel was in R&D. Intel is putting billions of dollars into R&D, but it's got to find some other way to save money somewhere else, right? So they know that if they put the plant outside of the United States, there's a couple of ways, or a few ways they can reduce costs. Land may be cheaper. Labor, the biggest factor here in this kind of plant, would certainly be cheaper. Even skilled labor. There are certain locations where you can find cheaper skilled labor outside of the United States. And certainly, that this always uppermost in the Intel site selection team's mind, where they knew that some governments would be very eager to attract this kind of investment. It'd be a very attractive investment in many ways. It'd bring in high-paying jobs, skilled jobs. would help a country diversify its production away from just, bananas and, coffee or something into making microprocessors, right? So it would be an opportunity for a country to move its economy sort of up the value chain and provide opportunities for its people and diversify what it did. So there's a really attractive investment for so many reasons for many countries. So Intel knew that it was likely to get some attractive incentives, some perhaps tax breaks and others. So that's why I think moving outside the United States made this a very important thing for Intel. Now, why specifically Latin America? Well, as mentioned in the case, Intel already had plants at the time that it did this, and it had plants in Europe and in Asia, and so they didn't have at that time any plants in Latin America. So, it makes sense to diversify your production process. You don't want all your eggs in one basket, right? You don't want, what if there's a regional crisis in some part of the world? You want to continue to be able to produce and so on. And so that was, I think, one of the reasons for this, putting the plant in Latin America. And Ted, of course, remember, Ted had taken my course on Latin America at Regional Business Environment of Latin America at Thunderbird. So when they told him, we only want you to consider Latin American locations, I would hope that went through his mind. I probably should have come to Nelson's class more often, but in any case, so this is why they decided to focus specifically on Latin America. And of course, as mentioned in the case, 100% of what was going to be produced in this plant was going to be exported primarily to the United States, to Europe as well, but primarily to the US, not sold in the domestic market. So that's how we can consider countries as diverse, right? The market size, like Brazil, with nowadays over 200 million people, and Costa Rica, with nowadays over 4 million people. If we were looking only at selling the product in the domestic market, then of course you would go immediately to Brazil. There'd be no doubt, right? But this 100% was going to be exported out primarily to US. And so Latin America is attractive for that reason, right? You can't get any closer to the United States and Latin America. In terms of low-cost locations, Canada doesn't count because it's a high-cost place. And that's how we can compare these very diverse countries, because the plan was to export everything. So that's why international, and that's why Latin America. Now, Intel, remember, could not just put this plant just anywhere in Latin America. It had certain requirements for a location, and that's the whole objective of this site selection analysis was, what countries would be suitable within the Latin American region? And this was, again, Ted's at least initial task, right, to come up with, a short list, the short list that could be, come up with at least from the desk research phase before actually traveling to the countries. So Ted, of course, understood that Intel had certain requirements, certain recommendations would be needed here, that they would, of course, need suitable numbers of advanced or skilled personnel. As I mentioned, thousands of mid-level technicians, at least a couple of hundred engineers, and you can't put a plant just anywhere in Latin America. You can't put a plant in the middle of the Amazon and find that readily. This other issue about labor unions was crucial, because Intel, at least as explained to me repeatedly by the Intel executives, Intel's manufacturing process is pretty unique in some respects. There are aspects here, even in the assembly and test phase, where you can't just stop the production. If you did that, there might be certain chemical processes that they're doing to these products that would destroy the whole batch or whatever it is you're producing. So Intel says, look, we just have to have a policy of not having labor unions. We simply do not have any unions in any of our plants anywhere in the world, and we're not going to start now. So one of the things that was involved in the site selection process was finding a location where the government would not require them to have a labor union. Transportation, infrastructure, and costs, of course, they needed a good airport, right? Obviously good roads and so on to get from the plant to the airport, but the airport was crucial. because they needed to get the product out of the country, and it was a light product. Microprocessors, they're very valuable, but they're light. You can have a lot of them on one, silicon wafer. And so this product, because it was light, was going to be exported by air. And so they needed a place, a location that had plenty of flights in and out of the country on a daily basis. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, of course, they're doing the just-in-time manufacturing process, and so it doesn't make sense. It's a very bad, management practice, by the way, to simply stockpile inventory for months at a time. That certainly is not a good practice. And this is a fast-paced, rapidly changing industry where, of course, you would want to get the product quickly to the customer. But on the other hand, something I didn't mention in the case is that these products, these microprocessors, were so valuable that if you put a whole lot of them in one cargo plane, no insurance company would insure you, right? For the cost if that plane went down, the insurance company said, well, you're not covering that. So they had to have a little bit shipped out every day, and that was a crucial aspect in the site selection process, an airport that had plenty of flights like that. And of course, you need available electrical power supply, low cost. They use a lot of electrical power, and reliable. Of course, they're looking for tax breaks, but this is a crucial thing. They also want stable, predictable rules, no special deals. And you might think initially, gee, those two things don't seem to correspond to each other. They seem to conflict with each other. But I think what's crucially important to understand is that, yes, Intel wanted the best tax breaks it could get in any country, but within the rules. And they were really, this was very important to them, no special deals, no any, underhanded tables or wink, wink. The governor of this state or the president of this country, we'll get you in here, we'll give you a special thing that we don't give anyone else, or, we'll break the rules, or we won't even follow our own rules. Intel said, we can't have that. We need a country, a location that has stable, predictable, transparent rules of the game that aren't going to suddenly change on us. And the reason this was so emphasized was, think, if you made a special deal like this, and then the governor that you made that deal with, or the president you made this secret special deal with, didn't get reelected. Think about that. Then you're back at square one, right? Then you're in trouble because the new governor might say, I'm not going to honor that. I didn't know about this. So that's why for Intel, they said, look, we have so many operations all over the world. We simply do not have time to deal with those kinds of changes. We need a place where the rules of the game are going to be relatively stable, predictable, and very transparent. And no special deals just for Intel. For this reason, we can't handle this constant, keeping track of what deal we made here and what. So that's why that was such a crucial factor for them.